Jake Cole was not a hero. He was not a soldier. He was not even the first choice for this mission. He was a 32-year-old government translator who ate cereal for dinner most nights and had a small crack in his apartment ceiling that he kept meaning to fix but never did. He was the kind of guy who double-checked his alarm 4 times before sleeping and still woke up worried he had turned it off. Normal. Completely, thoroughly normal. And yet somehow, on a Tuesday morning that started with bad coffee and a delayed shuttle, Jake Cole found himself standing in the longest hallway he had ever seen in his life, on a planet that was not Earth, about to walk into the throne room of Queen Vora of the Kethani people. He had been briefed, of course. Weeks of training. Hours of language study. His superiors back home had handed him a translator device the size of a thick TV remote and told him it was the most advanced piece of technology the human race had ever built. It would listen to him speak in English, process it in real time, and deliver a perfect translation in the Kethani tongue through a small speaker clipped near his collar. All he had to do was speak naturally, clearly, and calmly. Easy enough, they said. They also said the device had been tested hundreds of times without a single error. What they did not know, and what nobody had caught during those hundreds of tests, was that somewhere between Jake's shuttle leaving Earth's atmosphere and entering the gravitational field of Velthara, the translator had taken a hit from a low-level cosmic radiation burst. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that showed up on any screen or triggered any alarm. Just a quiet, invisible little damage to one very specific module deep inside the device. The module responsible for tone calibration. Jake did not know this. He just knew his palms were sweating. The hallway ended. 2 guards, tall, with silver-gray skin and eyes that caught the light like polished stone, pushed open a pair of enormous doors without making a single sound. And just like that, Jake was inside. The throne room of Queen Vora was not what he had imagined. He had expected something cold and intimidating, all sharp edges and harsh lighting. Instead, it was almost beautiful. High arched ceilings with thin beams of natural light cutting through from above. Rows of Kethani court members standing perfectly still on either side, dressed in deep blues and blacks. And at the far end, on a raised platform, sat Queen Vora herself. She looked younger than Jake had expected from the photos in the briefing files. But her eyes were old. The kind of eyes that had seen things and remembered all of them. She sat completely still with her hands resting on the arms of the throne, watching him walk toward her with an expression that gave nothing away. Jake stopped at the marked spot on the floor, exactly where he had been told to stand. He took a breath. He reminded himself of his opening line, the one he had practiced at least 50 times in front of his bathroom mirror. Simple. Respectful. Friendly. I come in peace on behalf of the people of Earth, and I am grateful for this opportunity. He said it. Clear and steady. He thought it came out pretty well, honestly. Maybe even a little smooth. What the broken translator delivered, in perfect Kethani spoken at exactly the pitch and weight of a formal warrior's declaration, was this. I have crossed the stars and I fear nothing. The room went silent. Not the polite kind of quiet that falls between words. A complete, total, heavy silence. The kind that has weight to it. Jake saw it ripple through the room like a wave, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the quick glances exchanged between court members, a few mouths that opened slightly and then closed again without making a sound. He noticed one advisor near the front actually take a small step backward. Jake had no idea what was happening. He assumed he had maybe mispronounced something. He smiled politely and waited, the way he always did when he was unsure, which was more often than he liked to admit. Queen Vora had not moved. Not even slightly. She was still watching him with those same steady eyes, but something in them had shifted. Something small but real. Like a door that had been closed for a very long time had just opened the tiniest crack. In all of Kethani history, not a single foreign visitor had ever stood in that throne room and said anything even close to what Jake had just apparently said. Ambassadors came with gifts and bowing and carefully worded speeches full of phrases like your greatness and your mercy and your infinite wisdom. They came soft. They came careful. They came ready to shrink themselves down to whatever size the room required. Nobody came in and announced they feared nothing. That was the kind of thing warriors said to each other before a duel. It was the kind of line that belonged on a battlefield, not in a diplomatic opening statement from a small human in a slightly wrinkled jacket who was, at that exact moment, quietly hoping nobody could see how badly his left hand was shaking. One of the senior advisors turned to another and whispered something sharp and urgent. A guard near the door shifted his weight forward ever so slightly, like a spring beginning to coil. And Queen Vora raised one hand. Just one hand, barely lifted from the arm of the throne. But every single person in that room stopped immediately and completely, like someone had pressed pause on the whole universe. She looked at Jake for a long moment. Then she said something in Kethani, low and measured. Jake's translator caught it and converted it into his earpiece. Asterisk, bring him closer. Asterisk. Jake swallowed. He walked forward. He was still smiling because he did not know what else to do. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about that crack in his apartment ceiling and how very much he would like to be standing under it right now. Nobody in that throne room had ever been brought closer to Queen Vora during a first meeting. Not once. Not in recorded history. Ambassadors from neighboring systems had spent years just trying to get into the building. And here was Jake, a guy who still used a paper grocery list because he never trusted himself to remember to check his phone, walking forward across that polished floor toward the most powerful ruler in this part of the galaxy. His shoes made a soft sound with every step. In that silence it felt very loud. He stopped about 6 feet from the platform. Close enough to see that Vora had a small scar along her left jawline, thin and faded, the kind that came from something that happened a long time ago. Close enough to see that she was not blinking very much. Close enough to feel very strongly that she was reading him the way people read a book they were not sure they trusted yet. Jake did what he always did when he felt cornered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his small notepad. Actual paper. His colleague back home, a woman named Rita who handled the tech side of these missions, had teased him about it endlessly. Nobody uses paper anymore, Jake. And Jake had always said the same thing back. Paper doesn't freeze, crash, or need charging. He flipped to the page he needed. His opening economic statement. 3 sentences, simple and clear, approved by 4 different government departments and reviewed by 2 alien culture experts. He had highlighted the key words in yellow. He had written small pronunciation notes in the margins. He had done everything right. He looked up at Queen Vora, who was now leaning forward slightly in her throne, chin resting near her hand, watching him with an expression that was genuinely hard to read. Not angry. Not warm. Something in between, like someone watching a strange animal do something unexpected and wanting to see what it would do next. Jake cleared his throat quietly. He said, carefully and clearly, asterisk, we hope for friendly trade between our people. Humans and Kethani both have things the other needs. We believe this can be good for everyone. Asterisk. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Practical. Balanced. Exactly the kind of language diplomats had used for centuries to open conversations about trade. Nothing bold about it. Nothing risky. Just honest and simple the way Jake preferred things. The translator processed it in less than a second. What came out of the speaker near his collar, delivered in the formal Kethani dialect with the full weight and gravity of someone making a sacred declaration before witnesses, was this. Asterisk, I offer you partnership. Not as a lesser to a greater, but as one power to another. Between equals. Asterisk. The silence that followed was different from the first one. The first silence had been shocked. This one was something else entirely. This one had texture to it. Jake could almost feel the room trying to figure out how to react, like everyone was waiting for someone else to decide what the correct response was supposed to be. The senior advisor, an older Kethani man with deep-set eyes and the kind of posture that suggested he had been doing this job for a very long time, made a sound that Jake could only describe as a controlled attempt not to collapse. His hand went to the edge of a nearby pillar. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like a man who suddenly needed something solid to hold onto. Another court member, younger, turned her face slightly to the side the way people do when they are trying to hide an expression they are not sure is appropriate. Her shoulders were very tight. Jake noticed none of this. He was looking down at his notepad, checking the next line, making sure he had not skipped anything important. He pushed his glasses up his nose. He wore old-fashioned frames because he could never get used to the lens implants everyone else seemed fine with, and gave a small satisfied nod to himself. Good. That had felt pretty natural. He thought it went well. He looked back up. Queen Vora had not moved from her slightly forward position. But something about her had changed. The careful, measuring quality in her eyes was still there, but now there was something alongside it. Something that had not been there before. A kind of alertness that was less like suspicion and more like genuine interest. The way someone looks when they pick up a book expecting it to be dull and read a line on the first page that surprises them. The Kethani did not use the word equal lightly. It was not a word that showed up in diplomatic meetings. It was a word that warriors used with each other after a hard fight, when both sides had proven something. It was a word shared between people who had earned each other's respect through some kind of real and difficult experience. Handing it to a foreign visitor in an opening statement was not done. It was simply not done. and this small, slightly rumpled human with his paper notepad and his old-fashioned glasses had just handed it to the Queen of the Kethani people like it was the most natural thing in the world. Vora leaned back slowly in her throne. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Jake started to worry again and almost reached for his notepad a second time. Then she did something that made every single person in the room go very still for a very different reason than before. She smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the kind of controlled, diplomatic expression that rulers put on for cameras and ceremonies. A real one. Small and quiet but real. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine and does not ask permission before it arrives. Her chief advisor looked like he needed to sit down immediately. Jake, completely unaware of what had just happened, smiled back. Because someone had smiled at him and that was what you did. He also made a small mental note that things seemed to be going pretty well so far, and that maybe he had been overthinking this whole mission from the beginning. He had absolutely no idea. Jake had a habit. When things felt like they were going better than expected, he got nervous. It was a strange quirk he had carried since childhood. Good moments made him suspicious. Like somewhere in the back of his head there was a small, unhelpful voice that always said, "Okay, but you probably did something wrong and just don't know it yet." And right now, standing in the throne room of Queen Vora, watching her smile at him in a way that had clearly surprised everyone else in the room, that voice was getting very loud. He started to run through the last few minutes in his head. The opening line. The trade statement. Both had felt fine to him. Natural even. But the room kept reacting in ways he couldn't quite explain. The stiffening. The sideways glances. That advisor who looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. None of it matched what Jake expected from a calm, friendly diplomatic introduction. He decided he must have said something slightly off somewhere. Maybe a wrong word. Maybe something that carried a meaning he wasn't aware of. It happened with translation all the time. He had read enough about Kethani culture during his briefings to know they had a very precise relationship with language. Words carried weight here in ways that didn't always have an English equivalent. So Jake, being Jake, decided the responsible thing to do was to acknowledge it. Clear the air. Just a small, honest, friendly apology. Nothing dramatic. Just a quick note to say, "Look, I'm new here, I'm learning, I'm sorry if anything came across the wrong way." That kind of thing. He straightened slightly, looked at Queen Vora with what he hoped was an expression that read as open and sincere, and said, "I want to apologize if anything I've said has been disrespectful. That was never my intention. I'm still learning about your culture and I have a lot of respect for everything you've built here." Completely reasonable. Humble even. The kind of thing that tends to soften any room and reset a conversation that has gone slightly sideways. The translator took those words and did something terrible to them. What came through the collar speaker, in the deep formal register of the Kethani warrior dialect, was delivered like a line from an oath ceremony. "I do not kneel. But I recognize strength when it stands before me. And I respect it." For a moment, nobody moved. Then General Terra moved. She was standing to the left of the throne, slightly behind and beside it, which was exactly where the Queen's head commander was always positioned during formal audiences. Jake had noticed her when he first walked in, mostly because she was the tallest person in the room and because she had the particular kind of stillness that certain people carry, the kind that doesn't come from being relaxed but from being very, very ready. General Terra had served Queen Vora for over 20 years. She had fought in 3 territorial conflicts, ended 2 of them personally, and was widely regarded as the most dangerous individual in the Kethani court. She was also deeply, completely loyal to Vora in a way that went beyond duty. And she had spent the last several minutes watching this small foreign human say things that no visitor had ever said in this room, watching her queen react in ways she had not seen in years, and she had held herself together through all of it with remarkable discipline. But "I do not kneel" was where she drew the line. Her hand moved to the side of her uniform where her weapon was secured. Not slowly. The motion was fast and practiced and completely automatic, the way a person reaches for something they have reached for 10,000 times before. Every court member within eye line of Terra immediately took a step back. Not because they were told to. Just because their bodies made the decision before their minds could. Jake heard the movement. He looked up from his notepad. He saw General Terra's hand at her side. He saw the expression on her face, which was the expression of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. He did not fully understand what was happening. But some very old and very basic part of his brain understood enough. His notepad hand froze. His mouth closed. He went very still in the particular way that humans go still when they suddenly realize the situation is more serious than they thought. And then Queen Vora spoke. One word. Short and sharp and final. Tara's hand stopped exactly where it was. She did not move it forward. She did not move it back. She just stopped, held in place by that single word the way everything in this room seemed to stop when Vora decided it should. Vora looked at her general for exactly 2 seconds. A look that said many things without saying any of them out loud. Then she looked back at Jake. Jake was still frozen. Still holding his notepad. Still wearing the expression of a man who has just understood, on some fundamental level, that he is in a situation that his preparation did not fully cover. Vora studied him for a long moment. Then she turned her head slightly toward her court and spoke, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The translator caught it and fed it into Jake's earpiece. Asterisk. Either this human is the most fearless being I have encountered in 20 years of receiving visitors. Or he is the greatest fool the universe has produced in recent memory. Asterisk. She paused. Asterisk. I have not yet decided which. But I find that I want to. Asterisk. And then she laughed. It was not a short, polite sound. It was a real laugh, full and genuine, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and doesn't ask for permission before arriving. It lasted several seconds. And in those seconds, something in the entire room shifted. The tension that had been pulled tight like a wire since Jake first walked through those doors released all at once. Several court members, after a beat of stunned hesitation, allowed themselves to breathe again. 1 or 2 smiled, carefully watching Vora to make sure it was allowed. General Tara slowly moved her hand away from her weapon. Her expression did not change much. But she looked at Jake with something new in her eyes. Not warmth exactly. More like the way someone looks at a locked door they cannot figure out. Curious, against their own better judgment. Jake stood in the middle of all of it with his notepad in his hand and his glasses slightly crooked on his face and absolutely no idea that he had just done something nobody in this room had witnessed in years. He just knew that the Queen was laughing, and that General Tara was no longer reaching for anything, and that both of those things seemed like improvements over where the situation had been 30 seconds ago. He pushed his glasses back up his nose. He decided cautiously that things were probably fine. The audience had been paused. That was the official word for it, paused. One of the senior advisors had approached the throne, spoken quietly to Queen Vora, and she had nodded and said something brief that Jake's translator caught as approximately asterisk 15 minutes. Asterisk then everyone had sort of redistributed themselves around the edges of the room in the way people do at formal events when there's a break and nobody is quite sure if they're allowed to relax yet. Jake had been guided, politely but firmly, to a small side area near the left wall. There was a narrow bench there and a table with a pitcher of something that was probably water but was a slightly unusual color. He sat down. He put his notepad on his knee. He stared at the floor for a moment and tried to figure out why every single thing he had said seemed to land like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room in ways he couldn't predict or explain. He was so deep in his own thoughts that he almost didn't notice the young aide who came and stood beside him. The aide was young. That was the first thing Jake registered. Young even by Kethanese standards, which he knew from his briefings tended to measure age a little differently than humans did. He had the look of someone who was junior enough to still be nervous about everything and senior enough to have been trusted with small but real responsibilities. He was holding a narrow tablet to his chest with both hands, the way students hold folders when they're not sure what to do with their arms. He stood there for a second. Then he leaned down slightly and spoke in a very low voice. "I need to tell you something," he said. In English. Careful and accented but clear. "About your device." Jake looked up. "You speak English?" "Some," the aide said. "I studied. For this meeting. In case." He glanced toward the throne and then back at Jake. "My name is Ron. I am a translation aide. Junior level. I have been monitoring the device output since you arrived." Jake felt something shift in his chest. Not quite dread. More like the specific feeling of realizing you've been walking in the wrong direction for a while and are only now checking the map. "Monitoring it," Jake repeated slowly. "And?" Ron pulled the tablet slightly away from his chest and looked at it briefly, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he looked back at Jake with an expression that mixed genuine sympathy with the particular discomfort of someone delivering news they really wish they didn't have to deliver. "Your device," Ron said carefully, "has not been translating what you say." "Not exactly. There is damage inside to the tone system. It has been taking your words and reshaping them into something older. A formal register that is not used anymore in normal speech. It is used in..." He paused, searching for the right English words. "Old war texts. Ceremonial challenges. Declarations before battle." Jake stared at him. "It has been turning everything you say," Ron continued, his voice dropping even lower, into something like ancient warrior poetry. The silence that followed that sentence lasted quite a long time. Jake sat very still. He thought about his opening line. I come in peace. He thought about the trade statement. We hope for friendly trade. He thought about the apology. I'm sorry if anything came across wrong. He played each one back in his head and then tried to imagine what version of those words had actually been coming out of that speaker near his collar, landing in the ears of the queen in her court and her very armed and very serious general. The color left his face in a way that was gradual and then sudden, like a slow leak and then a drop. Every single thing I said, Jake said. Not really a question. Every single thing, Ron confirmed with genuine sorrow in his voice. Jake put his notepad down on the bench beside him. He took his glasses off and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose for a moment. He sat like that for a few seconds, very quietly, doing the private mental math of a person who is calculating exactly how much trouble they are in. Then he put his glasses back on. He picked up the translator device from his belt clip and looked at it. This small piece of technology that 4 different departments had called the most reliable human invention in recent history. That had been tested hundreds of times. That had been handed to him with complete confidence. He turned it over in his hands once. Then he stood up. Ron blinked. What are you doing? Going back in, Jake said. Ron started. To tell her, Jake said simply. He was already moving toward the main floor. Can you come with me? In case my pronunciation is bad. Ron looked at him the way people look at someone doing something they cannot quite decide is brave or deeply unwise. Then he fell into step beside him because apparently his feet made the decision before his brain did. The court noticed them walking back to the center of the room. Conversations that had started during the break went quiet. People drifted back toward their positions. Queen Vora, who had been speaking to one of her advisors near the side of the throne, turned and looked at Jake with that same steady expression she had worn for most of the morning. Jake stopped at his spot. He looked down at the translator device in his hand for 1 second. Then he clicked it off. The small indicator light on the side went from green to dark. He took a breath. And then he spoke. In Kethani. His own Kethani, which he had been studying from audio files on the long shuttle journey over, repeating phrases quietly to himself in his bunk late at night, making notes in the margins of printed transcripts. It was not good Kethani. It was slow and careful and shaped wrong in places and probably a little painful to listen to if you grew up speaking the language. But it was real and it was his and there was no device between him and it. He told her the translator was broken. He explained what it had been doing. He told her, word by careful word, what he had actually meant to say when he walked in. I come in peace. We want friendly trade. I'm sorry if I said anything wrong. He went through all of it. Every line. Every moment. He did not skip the part where he said he had been checking notes on a paper pad because he didn't trust himself to remember. He did not skip the part where he thought things were going well and had no idea why the room kept reacting so strangely. He stood there in the middle of the Kethani throne room and told the most powerful ruler in that part of the galaxy that he was a regular person who had made a series of accidental and slightly ridiculous mistakes, and that he was sorry, and that he hoped it hadn't ruined everything. It took him a long time because his vocabulary was limited and he had to stop twice and quietly ask Ron for a word he didn't know. When he finished, the room was completely silent. The senior advisor had the expression of a man watching something he did not have a category for. General Terra's arms were crossed and her face was unreadable, which Jake had started to learn was actually different from her dangerous face, though only slightly. Several court members were exchanging looks that Jake couldn't interpret. Queen Vora had not moved through any of it. She sat exactly as she always sat, still and straight, and she watched Jake with those old and careful eyes until he was finished. Then she was quiet for a moment longer. When she spoke, she stood up first, which Ron later told Jake was something she almost never did. She said in slow clear Kethani so that Jake could follow it. Asterisk, many have stood in this room and tried to appear greater than they are. You have stood here and shown yourself exactly as you are, including the foolish parts. That is not a small thing. Asterisk. She paused. Asterisk, a being who walks back into a room to confess his own mistakes, in a language that is not his own, in front of people he has every reason to want to impress. That being does not lack courage. Whatever else he may lack. Asterisk. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she sat back down. Jake nodded slowly. He understood most of it. Enough of it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his notepad. He wrote 2 words on the bottom of the page in English just for himself. Still here. He figured that was enough for now. The signing happened in a smaller room. Jake had expected something grand for it. Another enormous hall, maybe. More guards, more court members, more of that heavy ceremonial silence that seemed to fill every large space in the Kethani palace. But instead one of Vora's advisors led him and Ron down a quieter corridor to a room that was almost modest by comparison. Round table, 6 chairs, tall narrow windows that looked out over a landscape of pale hills and a sky that was a color Jake didn't have a good English word for. Somewhere between gold and gray depending on which way the light moved. Queen Vora was already seated when they arrived. She had 2 advisors with her. Jake had Ron, his notepad, and a pen he'd borrowed from Ron because the one he brought had stopped working somewhere over the 3rd planet they passed on the way in. The document itself had been prepared by both sides weeks in advance. Jake's people had worked on it for months. Trade access, resource sharing, communication rights, a framework for future meetings. All very carefully worded, all reviewed multiple times by people much more senior than Jake who were much better at this kind of thing in theory. It sat in the middle of the table in 2 versions. One in English, one in Kethani. Both thick. Both covered in the particular dense language that legal and diplomatic documents always use, the kind that somehow takes a simple idea and stretches it across 4 paragraphs. Jake sat down across from Vora. He looked at the document. Then he looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was quieter than the one she'd worn in the throne room. Less formal. Not warm exactly, but something adjacent to it. The way a person looks at someone they've decided they don't mind being in a room with. The signing itself took about 12 minutes. There were specific places to initial, specific places to sign fully, a particular order that the Kethani protocol required and that Ron quietly guided Jake through in a low voice. Jake's handwriting was not impressive. It never had been. His signature looked like what happened when someone started writing a letter and then changed their mind halfway through. He had been mildly embarrassed about it his whole life. He signed his name in that slightly chaotic way in 3 separate places and tried not to think about how it looked next to Vora's signature, which was precise and controlled and exactly what you'd expect from someone who had been doing everything with complete intention for her entire adult life. When it was done, one of the advisors collected the documents carefully. Vora looked at the table for a moment, then back at Jake. She said something short in Kethani. Ron translated quietly into Jake's ear. Asterisk, acceptable. Asterisk. Jake nodded. Yeah, he said. Same. He was pretty sure that was the least dramatic ending to the most significant diplomatic event in human history. But it felt right somehow. It felt honest. And Jake had always preferred honest over impressive. The shuttle home took 4 days. Jake spent most of it sleeping, which he hadn't done properly in about a week. He ate the packaged food that tasted like cardboard and didn't complain about it. He reread his notes from the whole trip, filling in details he hadn't had time to write down during the actual events. He wrote a lot about the throne room. About General Terra's hand moving to her side. About the silence that followed each thing he accidentally said. About Ron's face when he delivered the news about the translator. He also wrote, near the bottom of one page in small letters, Asterisk, I don't think I actually did anything right. I just didn't run. Maybe that was enough. Asterisk. He wasn't sure if that was a comforting thought or a worrying one. He decided it was probably both. His supervisor back home was a woman named Patty. She had been running the diplomatic translation department for 11 years, had overseen 43 first contact missions, and had the particular energy of someone who had seen enough strange things that almost nothing surprised her anymore. She was sharp and practical and not especially given to sentiment, which Jake had always appreciated about her. She called him into her office the morning after he landed. He sat across from her desk, still slightly adjusted to Earth gravity in that specific way you feel after a long journey, and she looked at him with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and said, "Walk me through it." So Jake walked her through it. All of it. The throne room entrance. The trade statement. The accidental apology. General Terra. The moment he turned the translator off and switched to his own broken Kethani in front of the entire court. He told it plainly in the order it happened, without dressing anything up or making himself sound better than he was. When he finished, Patty was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The device malfunctioned." "Yes," Jake said. And instead of stopping and explaining the situation immediately, you continued for approximately 40 minutes delivering what amounted to ancient warrior declarations to the Kethani queen and her entire court. "That's accurate," Jake said. And then you turned the device off and confessed everything in broken Kethani. "Also accurate." Patty looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the signed trade agreement sitting on her desk, which represented terms that 3 previous diplomatic teams over 6 years had failed to secure. Resource access that scientists back home had said would take a decade to negotiate. Communication rights that nobody had seriously expected to get on a first visit. She looked back at Jake. The translator broke, she said again, slowly, like she was testing the sentence. Yes, Jake said. She pressed her lips together. Jake, I have been doing this job for 11 years. I know, he said. That, she said, pointing at the document, does not happen because a translator breaks. Jake opened his mouth and then closed it again. He didn't have a better explanation. He had the real one, and she didn't believe it, and he wasn't sure he entirely believed it himself when he said it out loud in a normal office on a normal planet. My device malfunctioned and accidentally made me sound like a warrior poet, and the Queen found it interesting enough to sign a historic trade deal. It sounded less plausible with every telling. He shrugged. The translator broke, he said one more time, simply because it was true. Patty made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. She signed his mission completion form and told him to take 3 days off. Word got around the way it always does. Not the full story. Nobody seemed to have the full story except Jake and Ron and possibly General Tara, who Jake suspected knew exactly what had happened and had filed it away in whatever private record she kept of things that didn't fit normal categories. But enough got around. People in the department started looking at Jake a little differently. Not with the kind of admiration that gets loud and obvious. Just with a quieter version of it, the kind that shows up in the way people make room for you in a conversation or remember what you said the last time. Jake found it slightly uncomfortable and mostly tried to ignore it. He went back to his regular work. Translation reviews, briefing documents, prep files for other people's missions. He fixed the crack in his apartment ceiling finally, on a Saturday afternoon with a kit from the hardware store. He went back to eating cereal for dinner when he was tired. He called his mother and told her the mission had gone fine, which was technically true and also left out approximately everything. 2 years passed. Quietly, the way most time passes when nothing dramatic is happening. Then Jake was sent to a galactic summit. Not as the lead. He was part of a larger human delegation this time, one of 6 people, seated toward the middle of a long table in a conference room that had representatives from 9 different species. The kind of event that generated very long documents and very careful speeches and a lot of polite waiting while things got translated into multiple languages. He was on the second day, slightly tired, reading through a briefing packet during a short recess, when he heard a Kethani ambassador across the room use a word he didn't recognize. His new translator device. A replacement, different model, fully tested, caught it and put it in his earpiece. But instead of a clean translation, it flagged the word as new vocabulary, recently added to the formal Kethani lexicon, definition still being standardized across translation databases. Jake frowned slightly. He pulled up the word on his tablet. Looked at the origin date. Looked at the rough definition that the database had assembled from context. Asterisk Jaketal. Verb and noun form. Approximate meaning. One who arrives without armor, speaks without pretense, falls without planning, and does not leave. One who stumbles into the place they were supposed to be. Asterisk. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he read it again. He sat back in his chair. Around him the summit continued, people moving and talking and papers being shuffled. He was quiet for a while, long enough that the person next to him, a younger diplomat named Greg, glanced over and asked if he was okay. Yeah, Jake said. Fine. Just... He stopped. Nothing. I'm fine. He didn't say anything else about it. He finished the summit. He flew home. He went to his apartment and found the broken translator device in the box where he'd stored it after getting the replacement. He turned it over in his hands the way he had that day in the throne room. Same small crack along the casing that he'd noticed afterward. Same dead indicator light. He went to a small shop the next morning and bought a glass case. The kind people use for old watches or small collectibles. He put the device inside and set it on the corner of his desk. He stood there for a minute looking at it. Then he went and found a piece of card and a pen and wrote 5 words in his slightly chaotic handwriting. He propped it inside the case, leaning against the back. Better than a college degree. Then he sat down, pulled up his current work file and got back to it. There was a briefing document due by Thursday and he hadn't started the second section yet. The ceiling in the kitchen was making a new sound he didn't like. He was almost out of cereal. Life for Jake Cole continued more or less exactly as it always had. Except for the word. Across the stars, in a language that had existed for thousands of years, there was now a word that had his name in it. He thought about that sometimes. Usually late at night when the apartment was quiet. He'd look at the glass case on his desk and the dead little device inside it and think about a throne room on a planet with a gold-gray sky and a queen with old careful eyes who laughed for the first time in years because a nervous man with a paper notepad and a broken machine had walked back into a room he had every reason to walk away from. He never got tired of thinking about it,